Good morning and welcome to this month's edition of Last Month in Criminal Justice. We're going to be covering criminal justice developments during October in this particular edition, and I'm delighted to be joined by some excellent panelists and discussants, joined by my colleague Helen Mills from the Centre for Crime and Justice Studies, by Joe Phoenix from the Open University, and by Hannah Quirk from King's College London. We have a fairly packed subject areas to cover today. We're going to be starting by looking at the KC review into the Metropolitan Police following the conviction of Wayne Couzens for the murder of Sarah Everard. Then we're going to be moving on to the investigation by the Independent Office of Police Conduct into the investigation into the murder of Bibaa Henry and Nicole Smallman, also therefore an issue in relation to the Met Police. Then we're going to be talking about the conviction of Penelope Jackson for the murder of her husband, David Jackson. Moving then on to looking at some recent inspectorate reports on youth offending institutions in particular. Look again also then at another prison issue, rise in self-harm. We'll then be looking at the event that the Centre held last week with Women's Place UK, A Woman's Place is not in prison. And then finally, we're wrapping up with a discussion of the Police Crime in Sentencing and Courts Bill. Now, we're going to be using the Q&A function. You should all have access to that. So if you want to pose a question to the panel, then please put your question in the Q&A function. Bear in mind that we're going to keep the programme moving forward. So, as I said, we'll be starting with looking at the KC review into the Metropolitan Police. If you feel you have something to say about that, you want to ask a question, get your questions in early, because once we finish that item, we're going to be moving on to the next item, and it won't then be possible to go back to that. So if you have any questions, do get them in early. But we're going to start now with a discussion on the KC review of Metropolitan Police. So just for a bit of background, in the October edition of this programme, we discussed the inquiry into the Met that was announced by the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, during her party conference speech. And the announcements followed the conviction of a serving police officer, Wayne Couzens, for the awful murder of Sarah Everard. The Home Secretary also asked the Police Inspectorate to undertake a thematic inspection of vetting and counter-corruption procedures across policing in England and Wales. Now, since our last edition, the Metropolitan Police has separately announced that Baroness Louise Casey will lead an independent review into the Met's culture and standards of behaviour. And the Met has said that Louise Casey's review and recommendations will be published. And the Met also themselves announced an urgent examination into all current investigations of sexual and domestic abuse allegations. In September, the iNews website reported that more than 750 Met police employees have faced sexual misconduct allegations since 2010. So there we have a number of overlapping inquiries and reviews. I think there's at least 4 that I've counted, and that doesn't include the ongoing investigation by the Independent Office of Police Conduct into Kent Police, where Wayne Couzens worked prior to his transfer to the Met. And we also have investigations into a number of individual officers. So plenty of heat there, plenty of inquiries, but are they going to shed much light on what really happened and on the state of policing in the UK today, and particularly the Metropolitan Police? So let's turn to our panel now. I can see you all hiding behind their cameras. Would you like to be joined, a panel of you'd like to join us now? And then we'll move on. There we go. Lovely. Thank you. So let's first talk about this inquiry. Joe, plenty of inquiries, potential overlap there. What do you think? Do you think it's ever going to really shed much light on the Wayne Couzens incident in particular and the state of the Metropolitan Police in general?
So it's a great question, Richard. To be perfectly frank, I think that we've had so many of these, and it does shed light. It sheds light on the individual instances. But, I'm old enough to remember, and forgive me for saying this, but when I did my PhD, so we're back in 1993-94, when I was collecting evidence, and of course this was, collecting data, this was around street working prostituted sex work women, a very different constituency than you see these days. And it was well known that the police would often pick the women up from the streets and in effect abuse them. And that was well known back then. Now it's gratifying to see an inquiry that's looking specifically about misconduct of the police towards women. Do you know what I mean? In my mind, that's probably the first time we've seen that. But then I'm not sure that things like the McPherson report actually tackled the problem of things like racism from the police towards communities. So I don't feel very hopeful that the report, apart from shedding light, will actually deal with the problem of police misconduct or police, sex-based violence towards women.
All the inquiries are quite narrowly defined. The one that the Home Secretary announced, effectively looking at the events around Wayne Couzens leading up to the murder that he perpetrated against Sarah Everard, and then just some specific questions about, vetting and recruitment and all that. And likewise, I suspect that will be the case with the Casey review, although I'm not sure that the terms of reference of that have been announced yet. So the wider question about whether, for example, the Metropolitan Police are institutionally misogynist, you mentioned the McPherson inquiry that concluded it was institutionally racist. But 20 years on, has anything really happened there? But the sense of whether there's going to be a broad enough inquiry that will actually ask some big questions, rather than just focusing on the individual conduct of particular officers, however problematic and worrying that might be, strikes me as being something which is rather unaddressed in so far in the inquiries that have been announced.
Yeah, I couldn't disagree with you. And then also it's kind of like, even let's just say for the sake of argument that Louise Casey's inquiry ends up being exactly the sort of inquiry that I might want to set up, for instance. Do you know what I mean? Which actually was broad-ranging and deep and really got to the heart of the issue. Then it also leaves unaddressed, well, what do you do with that information afterwards? Do you know what I mean? Because there isn't how one would then go about reforming the police. And of course, I don't know why anyone would think it isn't institutionally misogynistic, although I have to say, and I might part ways with you, Richard. I don't know about what you think, Hannah. I feel a little uncomfortable with terms like institutional misogyny, apart from the fact that it's difficult to say. I feel uncomfortable because this isn't institutionally based, although it has an institutional expression. This is just a reflection of wider social inequalities that are, kind of grounded in much bigger processes. So it's not just the police just reflect, wider issues.
I think some of that's true. And I think your point about what will actually be done with it is important. I read a comment somebody made online about how criminologists talk about canteen culture and this idea of, the police banter being racist and sexist. And, it's a bit of a trope, but actually saying that it's the decline of things like police canteens where they could sit and talk to each other and learn about other people's behavior, that it was much easier to spot when somebody was problematic, like Wayne Couzens, for example, when you actually had more contact. And this closing down of police canteens and, atomizing their work is part of the problem of this, because it then makes it much more difficult to build cultures or improve behaviors.
Although, is there an argument there that the canteen culture could also reinforce?
Well, I think that's where it's always been used, that it was always seen as a reinforcing bad behaviors, but that actually losing that social contact can be problematic. And I think also we shouldn't attack all officers. And I'm not suggesting you've done that, but I think, as the judge at Couzens's trial said, it was police officers who found her, put the evidence together, liaised with the family. And it does bother me that, particularly with people, endlessly calling for Cressida Dick's resignation, who's going to want to take these jobs?
Yeah, quite.
I mean, I always start any lecture on policing by saying, I'm too much of a coward to do their job. I couldn't do it. And it does worry me slightly that, you know, as with politics, as with many jobs, that, you know, the relentless negativity might mean that the people who end up going into these jobs are not the people we want doing them. So there is obviously a need for change, but I think maybe we need to make sure we're taking people with us as well, rather than just making them feel under siege.
You know, you raised something really interesting, and you know, this is the old-fashioned sociologist in me. Do you remember the discussions that we all used to have back in the 1990s when they started introducing antisocial behavior orders? And some of the discussions that we were having were things like, well, don't bring in ASBOs, bring back bus conductors, you know, bring back park attendants, because all of these people help generate that kind of informal level of social control that operates in a very benign fashion, but helps us to kind of set both standards of behavior, but locate us within particular social groups. And of course, you know, that's that double-edged sword, isn't it, with the canteen culture? It may well have reproduced some of the narratives that aren't, you know, and the ways of behaving that aren't very good, but it also operated to keep people together and be able to isolate some whose behaviors are truly problematic. So I think that's a great thing to think about. And I'm totally with you, and I'm sure, well, Richard, you can say, you know, about the, you know, I've never wanted to bash the police. I've never wanted to bash social workers. I've never wanted to bash the CPS or politicians, because, you know, these jobs, I think particularly for the police, that job is a really difficult job. They have to do things that many of us have never had to do. Never.
This is Last Month in Criminal Justice with me, Richard Garside. We're discussing the October developments in criminal justice with a fantastic panel, Helen Mills, Hannah Quirk and Joe Phoenix. We're going to be moving on to the next item shortly, but I just wanted to pick up on one final quick point, just to see if our panel have any thoughts on this. One of the criticisms of the announcement that the Home Secretary Priti Patel made about the proposed inquiry that she announced was that it was going to be non-statutory. And what that means is that, amongst other things, the inquiry will have limited capacity to compel witness testimony. Now, this has been an issue with with most recently the Daniel Morgan inquiry that took years and years to conclude. And one of the points that the chair of the inquiry said was that because the Metropolitan Police were not required to submit evidence, it did make the work of the inquiry very difficult. So really just a thought from any of our panelists, whether, you know, the debate about statutory versus non-statutory inquiries, and if any of you have any thoughts on that, particularly in relation to this particular inquiry that Priti Patel announced.
Well, I understand. Sorry.
So some of my work, or where I've come to kind of know the inquiry model a bit, is on police spying and the public inquiry into police spying, which is a statutory inquiry, but unsurprisingly, perhaps that has faced particular problems hosting a public inquiry about a covert issue, which probably maybe we'll come on to a bit later. But going back to what Joe said before about the purpose really of an inquiry, and those being kind of, and where we therefore set our expectations. So if we see the purpose as threefold, it's about what happened, why it happened, how do we stop it happening again? I think where the low expectations must most come in is of that latter question. How do we stop it happening again? Because anyone with any reasonable history around criminal justice knows the sheer number of inquiries and the lack of process that has followed them, and progress that has followed them. So one thing that I was just looking at was some work that the Institute for Governance has done around public inquiries, which in the hierarchy of inquiries are like seen as top dog, I suppose. And they showed that they had 68 public inquiries have taken place across all topics. It's not just criminal justice since 1990. Of which, how many do you think were followed up by select committees to see what the government did as a result? It was 6 out of 68 were followed up. Wow. And just one more interesting graphic I want to share with you from that Institute for Governance work was they did a nice graphic about the number of public inquiries and the name of the chair. So all women, this is between 1900, all right, a while ago, and 2018. So the number of inquiries that have had a woman's name as chair is the same as the number of inquiries that have been chaired by someone called Brian.
Chaired by someone from...
someone called Brian, who has the first name Brian, right? And less than those who have been chaired by someone with the name William or Anthony, which were the highest. So I guess what they're pointing at there is the lack of diversity in the chair.
Thank you. We're going to have to move on to our next item, but that's a really fascinating way to end this discussion. And what I'll suggest is that we will share the link to that Institute for Government Analysis in the follow-up email to everyone who's attended, and indeed those who sadly weren't able to make it today. Keep your questions coming in on the Q&A. We have one here from Mark Burton in relation to self-harm in prisons, but we'll pick that one up a little bit later in the programme. But now let's move on to the next item, which is also relates to Metropolitan Police. Over the weekend of the 6th and 7th of June last year, family members and friends reported that two sisters, Nicole Smallman and Bibaa Henry, were missing. To the family, the police appeared uninterested, which led to the family themselves mounting their own search. And very sadly, both their bodies were found by Nicole Smallman's boyfriend, Adam Stone. They had been repeatedly stabbed. Nicole and Bibaa's mother, Mina Smallman, said at the time, "I knew instantly why they didn't care, they being the police. They didn't care because they looked at my daughter's address and they thought they knew who she was, a black woman who lives on a council estate." Two police officers just this week have been convicted after they admitted that they took and shared pictures of Nicole and Bibaa's bodies at the scene via WhatsApp. Also in this month, or in the month we're covering in October, the Independent Office of Police Conduct reported their summary findings of the investigation into Nicole Smallman and Bibaa Henry's murder. And whilst they concluded that there had been failings in the way that the police had conducted the search, they concluded likewise that there was no evidence to indicate that this failure was the result of stereotyping or biased assumptions based on the sisters' race or where they lived. The Metropolitan Police have apologised to the family, but Mina Smallman has herself said, and I quote, "There were approximately 14 people, friends and family, involved in our missing persons investigation, which started at approximately 4 a.m. on Saturday morning and ended with Nicole's precious Adam discovering their bodies. This lasting image of his soulmate will forever remain in his mind's eye. Sorry just won't cut it. It's too hollow." Now, the Metropolitan Police Commissioner has written to Sadiq Khan in early October when she wrote to him and said, "We fully understand the questions being asked of us as an organisation, and we welcome scrutiny to help us to do what is needed to improve and rebuild confidence." But is this true? If it is true, why more than 2 decades after the report into Stephen Lawrence murder are the police still talking about rebuilding community confidence? Helen, we were talking about this earlier, and I know you have some thoughts about this particular very sad case.
Yeah, so I want to start because there's various, I think, bits to the case itself, but the bit I suppose I'm going to focus on is the summary report by the IOPC, into the missing persons inquiry, which, as you said, stated that they were failings. The failings they found were administrative and related to how...
Sorry, Sarah, sorry, Helen, can I just interrupt for a second? There's a bit of tapping going on your end, but I think there's maybe something rattling on your desk, but I don't want to put you off your train of thought there.
Oh, okay, all right, let me know. Sorry, I'm not sure what the tapping is, but let's see if we can all track it together. Let me know when I tap. The IOPC investigation was into how the missing person inquiry was conducted, because, as you point out, it was the family and friends and their search for which sadly discovered the two sisters' bodies. So the failings they found were administrative. They related to how the calls were handled from family and friends to report the women missing, that there wasn't sufficient oversight, and that there hadn't been communication with the family that they had been told police resources were being deployed to investigate the girls being missing. They were in fact not being deployed until the following morning. Obviously, a key window was missed there in terms of looking for the sisters, and what then resulted in terms of the search the family and friends conducted, finding the bodies, and also into how some of the calls were handled, and the women being referred to as suspects by the police call handler. So there were some of the complaints. Now, so far, the IOPC investigation and its summary account is about the individuals involved and their conduct and the failings. And perhaps the key failings here in relation to missing inquiries is that when the family initially rang up and reported the women missing, that did not result in a missing person report, and should have, but did not. But as you said, Richard, that the IOPC also considered that these were administrative issues and not to do with ethnicity, and not to do with the geographic location of where the girls were based. It reminded me very much, Jo said earlier she had something that reminded her of her PhD. It reminded me very much of a PhD I started to apply for and then did not progress, about the case of Hannah Williams, which I would encourage people to look for if they're not aware of it. Hannah Williams was a 14-year-old girl whose body was discovered in Kent in an industrial estate. So her, this is going back 20 years now, she was a white, working class 14-year-old girl who, to cut a very long story short about her, there was no national media campaign, and at the time, investigation into the police conduct of the missing inquiry found that there was misconduct over 3 officers that had conducted the initial inquiry, essentially about their slowness to act. And the key quotes I kind of remember from it was, this was not a family that we could build a case around, we could have a press campaign around. They essentially were her body was found when they were actually looking for, sadly, another teenage girl who was missing at the time, called Daniel Jones. What I recall about this, and it's an opening line from the journalist Martin Bright's subsequent investigation into missing person cases, and into both the police inquiries and to the media coverage they generated. So he opened his journalist piece with this line: "There are certain rules in the missing person game. Don't be a boy, don't be working class, don't be black. As for persistent runaways, children in care, or teenagers with drug problems, forget it." So just stepping back from the specific failings in the Nicole Smallman and Bibaa Henry case, the scale of interest in some missing inquiries and that they generate, particularly in terms of press coverage, is overwhelming. And I think it kind of obscures from view all the other circumstances within which people go missing.
And picking up on one of those points, Helen, I mean, so the IOPC is saying there's no evidence that there were assumptions made. But as quoting from Martin Bright's article, I mean, obviously he's making a very clear statement there. And it comes back to actually our earlier conversation, I suppose, about trying to distinguish between individual failings of individual officers and the tendency to focus on that, rather than thinking about sort of institutional and cultural questions, and of course ultimately societal questions, because people have also made the comment about how the awful disappearance and murder of Sarah Everard appeared to many people to get a lot more media interest than than Bibaa Henry and Nicole Smallman. So there's kind of wheels within wheels here, aren't there?
Yeah, and it's something, when the IOPC say there is no evidence, what they're referring to is that they looked at, call logs, they looked at communication between officers over their walkie-talkies. Is that old-fashioned? Whatever the modern equivalent is of the walkie-talkie. And there was no evidence that the women were racially discriminated against, nor was there any evidence that their area was talked of between officers. So what they're talking about there is, as you say, is whether individuals were being discriminatory in the way they were conducting the investigation, and they're not. It's not about the kind of wider, as Joe says, the wider social processes that inform whether a case fits or doesn't fit in how we, progress a missing person inquiry.
I think there's differences.
I would also say that IOPC investigation has only given individual findings currently. There is a later point at which they will give their general findings, so we should be waiting for that too.
I think there's differences between the press coverage cases get, which undoubtedly is skewed, and the way in which the police investigate cases. I mean, I think maybe we also need to think these were adult women, so there is a difference in terms of if somebody's reported missing. It's not unusual for adults to not come home, or you would expect a different response to if a 14-year-old had gone missing or a 5-year-old had gone missing. So, and I mean, of course, the family it's just impossible to imagine what they've gone through. But I think this case has attracted a lot of attention. But again, it's that maybe trying to avoid the knee-jerk reaction that because they were Black, it wasn't investigated properly. I mean, the suspect has been apprehended very quickly and convicted. So we need to sort of separate the ideas of what's a social problem about which cases get coverage, and this one did, in fairness. I mean, I think Sarah Everard's was unique for a number of reasons. You would expect a case like that to, the fact it was a police officer, I think was so horrifying. But it's important to investigate, what is a discriminatory behaviour, what is a lack of resources, and then again, kind of how we respond to how we want these cases dealt with.
Thank you, Hannah. And I think in the way that you expressed yourself, I could sense that kind of feeling of finding the right words, because it's such a difficult subject to talk about, with very understandable and very kind of strong emotions on all sides for very good reason, and trying to find a way of talking about these things in a way that's kind of calm and respectful of the really awful experience in this case these two women's family been through, and the wider community, and it's very, very difficult to kind of find the right tone there. So thank you very much for kind of trying to contextualize some of these questions. Let's move on to our next item, which relates to the conviction of Penelope Jackson. So Penelope Jackson, a retired accountant who last week was found guilty of the murder of her husband, David. She was sentenced to at least 18 years in prison. I thought I'd get his heart, she told a 999 operator, but he hasn't got one. During her trial, her defence lawyer argued that she had lost control after years of abuse. The trial heard, for instance, that she had a tattoo above her right buttock that read, "Property of David Jackson." The trial and the conviction has reignited the debate about whether women whether women are underprotected as victims and overpunished as perpetrators. A report published earlier this year by the Centre for Women's Justice pointed out that most domestic homicides are committed by men. The few women who do kill their male partners have, in general, faced abuse, often quite prolonged abuse over a number of years, yet few are likely to be acquitted on grounds of self-defence. Reacting to Penelope Jackson's conviction, the solicitor and director of the Centre for Women's Justice, Harriet Wistrich, said, "There needs to be a radical transformation of the criminal justice system, which is still steeped in misogynistic myths and stereotypes. Women are punished most severely if they resist, whereas men who snap and kill for no reason get off lightly." So when it comes to domestic homicides, is it one rule for male perpetrators, another for female perpetrators? Hannah, your thoughts on this?
I feel like I'm a Daily Mail columnist in this group. I have enormous respect for the work the Centre for Women's Justice does. I don't think this case was the best way of making the point they want to. It seems to me that the fundamental difficulty Penelope Jackson's team had was the lack of evidence of coercive control and the lack of evidence that she had lost control. And I didn't sit through the trial, and I know what I've read in the papers, which is obviously quite selective. But the jury clearly wasn't persuaded, and the judge in his sentencing remarks talked about how he was quite confident that the attack was premeditated. There historically were a lot of difficulties. The defense used to be that people could use was provocation. So if somebody said something that was sort of really grievously insulting, or did something and you reacted in the heat of the moment, then that was a partial defense. And stereotypically that was used by men who found their wives in bed with somebody else, or in certain cases the nagging defense was used. There were also high profile cases of women who had suffered years and years of domestic abuse, who had killed their partners. And part of the work that was done in changing the law in this area was saying that characteristically women will often react differently to men, that an immediate reaction is a more stereotypically masculine response, whereas women may take longer to react. So they hear the final insult and it takes a while to react. Or more problematically, if they know the partner is much physically stronger than them. In many of these cases, they'd waited for the partner to go to sleep, which then meant they couldn't use the defense of having immediately lost control because they'd waited, or they'd gone and got a weapon, because again, in terms of physical strength, the only way really for a smaller woman to kill a bigger man would be using a weapon, whereas men in domestic violence tend to use, they can use strangling or much more physical force. So there are different defences and partial defences open to to all defendants. I think some of the cases that have been compared, again unfairly in this situation, I think, I've had a complete brain freeze on the name, the man in Bristol who lost control and killed his wife during lockdown. He was suffering from an anxiety depression, and she had said something and he said he lost control and strangled her. He was found guilty on the basis of diminished responsibility. If somebody's found guilty of murder, the judge has very little discretion in their sentencing. So it's usually a starting point of 15 years. If it's manslaughter by diminished responsibility, they've got much more flexibility. So I think comparing these cases is quite unfair. There was a really interesting point somebody made on Twitter yesterday to me about how maybe we should be looking at diminished responsibility in more situations. So for example, teenagers who we know, many of those who commit murder have had traumatic brain injuries, or haven't fully cognitively developed yet. So it's a very tricky area of the law, and obviously these very emotive examples. I think there may be issues around the use of loss of control, which is quite a problematic defense anyway. I don't think this case is the best one to use as an example of sexism within the criminal justice system.
Joe, did you?
Yeah, I just wanted to come in. I think that what you've just said, Hannah, is really illuminating. There's no two ways about it, because it's an almost forensic excision of different sorts of cases and the way in which law plays out in the courts. That kind of very grounded analysis. But there's another part of me that's like, how long have we been actually having to have this conversation about differential outcomes? And it just got me thinking as you were going through that really detailed, perhaps adding subtlety to how we understand that case, rather than just a kind of quick soundbite sort of analysis, is how we can end up in societies that are marked by such profound sex-based inequalities, right, and that are structured by them. How we can end up in this place where the just administration of legal processes, which I think is what you were trying to say, there are different legal processes here, they were administered in a just way, ends up with fundamentally unjust outcomes. And by that, I don't mean, you know, individual cases and what individual sentences get, but rather when you look across the wash of the last, you know, several hundred years, the sort of punishments and lack of protections that women experience vis-a-vis the over-protections, if you like, of male violence and under policing of it. Do you follow what I mean? So I think it's kind of like we need to look at those one-off instances, both from that forensic point of view, but also then to put that forensic point of view, that legal point of view, that very, you know, that very clear analysis that you gave, also into its wider social context, so that we can think about change and continuity and you know, and how we can change things. Because let's face it, you know, the idea that, you know, women are being over policed and under protected, we've been talking about that since, I don't know, the 70s.
I think there have been significant changes though. I mean, obviously the change from provocation to loss of control was a very significant change. The Sally Challen case, where there was recognition of coercive and controlling behavior, the fact that coercive and controlling behavior became a criminal offence. I think the last maybe 20 years, you know, there's been quite significant legislative change. I think it would be, I was talking, I gave a seminar paper the other day about homicide laws, and, you know, governments don't want to take hold of it. It's a boring technical piece of criminal law that's got very little political capital in it. But you're absolutely right. It has such profound consequences. And, you know, because they're high profile cases, because they're totemic, if people have the sense that the criminal justice system discriminates against women, or, you know, I mean, equally, there would be people who'd argue from the other side as well, that we do need to review these laws and to see not just that they are equal on paper, but the way in which people are able to avail themselves of criminal defences is really important. And the Law Commission did a huge piece of work on homicide about 15 years ago that was ignored because the government didn't particularly want to take it forward. I think it would be really important to, if you know, we have this Royal Commission on Criminal Justice, it's something they could perhaps take up, or even slotting it into these inquiries into how women are treated in the criminal justice system, because because of the lack of discretion in sentencing for murder. You know, if somebody is convicted, it's a mandatory life sentence. It's a minimum 15 years in prison. So if we could get the law looked at again, I think that would be really important. On its own, it's not going to happen because there's nothing in it for politicians. But if we could maybe piggyback it on the back of issues that are of topical importance, that could be really helpful.
That's really interesting.
The legal scholar, well, more than a legal scholar, Catherine McKinnon wrote many years ago in relation to laws on sexual violence, that the law defines rape from the male standpoint, and as a result, it doesn't prohibit rape, it regulates it. And I'm just wondering, Hannah, just in closing, just picking up on your earlier points, is there an argument that, you know, that actually maybe, you know, this was a just conviction in relation to what the current law is, but an unfair conviction because the way that these kinds of cases are treated is very much from the male standpoint?
Again, this case, from what I've read in the papers, and that's all I know, this doesn't strike me as the best example of that. I think the difficulty they had was the lack of evidence of coercive control, or that she had lost control. And I think that's presumably what the jury thought. There are cases you might be able to make a much better case for than this one.
Okay, thank you. That's really interesting. Right, well, let's move on to the next item. Before we do, our Q&A is relatively quiet at the moment, which is fine. Maybe our panelists who've absolutely excellent, maybe they're just answering all the questions that you have. But if you do have any questions that you'd like to pose, then you know, do put them in the Q&A. We're going to be talking about prisons inspectorate in a second, then we're going to move on to self-harm in prisons, then we're going to be talking about the Women's Place event. It was held in London last week. And then finally, we're going to be talking about the police crime sentencing and courts bill. So if you have any questions about any of those items, do get them into the chat. Right, let's move on then to the Inspectorate of prisons. A dry topic in some ways, but a very important one. Prisons and other places of detention are largely hidden from view. Their walls and fences are all that most of us will ever see. There's always a better use for a piece of land than as a place for a prison. So the argument for closing down prisons is a strong one. But at the same time, prisons are an ever-present reality in our societies today, and independent scrutiny of the condition that prisoners are held in is a very important democratic function. And that's the role of the Prisons Inspectorate for England and Wales. They just cover the England and Wales prisons. There are separate inspectorates that look at the situation in Scotland and Northern Ireland. Last month, they published 5 reports on prisons, 2 of them relating to children's prisons, and they're the ones that we particularly would like to focus on today. So first of all, Rainsbrook Secure Training Centre, inspectors there found that physical assaults on children were common. Children told inspectors that some of them were carrying weapons just in case. Of course we are not safe, commented one child. Somebody is going to die here soon, said another. Now, Rainsbrook has already been the subject of an urgent notification back in June when the inspectors originally inspected the site. And following that, all the children from Rainsbrook were moved out of that prison into other institutions. A further urgent notification, this time on Oak Hill Secure Training Centre, was issued just this month, or the month that we're covering, October. Inspectors there found that children were living, quote, in a dilapidated environment, experience frequent incidents of violence and use of force, and are often cared for by inexperienced staff. The campaign group Article 39 has called for an inquiry into Oak Hill, as well as demanding that government takes immediate steps to keep children safe and to prevent further human rights violations. So why is it in the 21st century we are in a situation where vulnerable children are being confined in such dangerous, damaging and traumatic conditions? Joey, what do you have to say about this one?
Politeness actually stops me saying what I actually think about this, to be perfectly frank with you.
Be as impolite as you like within broadcasting regulations.
Okay, it is appalling. It is appalling that we are here. I mean, bearing in mind, we can have a whole discussion about whether we should be placing children, right? I'm just going to stress that, whether we should be placing children into what are in effect kiddie prisons. We can have a whole discussion about that. And that's one that has to do with principle and as well as politics. There's a lot of evidence to say that we shouldn't be doing that, but let's just bracket that discussion off for a second. The fact that we actually do that in conditions where children are left unsafe is a marker of how cavalier our governments are with regards to taking seriously their obligations to ensuring the children who they are responsible for have a minimum standard of welfare, right? Because we have to remember, and I know I keep saying this, these are legal children. They can do many things, and we can have a whole nother discussion about agentic children who are also in conflict with the law and how we deal with that. We could have a discussion about that. But overall, the one thing that and Hannah's fine legal mind will be able to dissect some of my sociological glossings over details. But I think the one thing that we can all agree on is that when somebody is a legal child, there are many things they can do, but they have limited control over their environment. Now, if you then put them into a place that is designed solely and only for removing somebody's liberty, which is what incarceration is. We can add other things to it, but ultimately, to be incarcerated is to remove one's liberty. We've now put children who have so little control over their lives into a situation that they have even less control over. And then we do that in conditions that are as appalling as have been described in those 2 inspector reports. So yeah, I'm sorry, I'm not going to F and blind because that's rude and that's broadcasting. But I have nothing but contempt that we are back here in this place in the 21st century. This needs to be raised further up the political agenda because we shouldn't have this situation happening. We should not be reading reports like that.
I mean, one of the things that really struck me about the Oak Hill urgent notification was the reference to the Secure Training Centre, Oak Hill, as a dilapidated environment. Now, there are a number of prisons, as everybody, all the panel will know, and indeed I'm sure many people in our audience will know, there are many prisons that date back to Victorian period. There are prisons that go back further than that. I mean, Brixton Prison, for example, was opened in 1818. It's 200 years old. Dartmoor even older than that. So there are some very old prisons, and you'd expect maybe some of them to be described as dilapidated. But Oak Hill is I don't exactly know when it was built, but it's a pretty new building. So what is that saying, just on a really mundane level, in terms of maintenance of prison buildings? It's something as modern as Oak Hill is being described as dilapidated.
Can I just jump in there though, Richard? So absolutely, 100%, what does it say? But also dilapidation doesn't happen overnight. Do you know what I mean? You don't take a modern place and then, wake up one morning and go, oh my, look, overnight it became dilapidated. This is long-term disinvestment, long-term lack of interest. And can I also just pick something else out about the Rainsbrook report? When I read that, I mean, it was difficult reading, right? For me, difficult reading. But what really struck me is, what on earth are we doing that we are putting children into places where they are speaking of such fear? Because I mean, we can talk about lack of safety, but to me, when I read many of the things that the children said, I thought, oh my God, these children are living in fear. And given that we, as a state, a government, are responsible for that and responsible for the disinvestment of the dilapidation, in Oak Hill, it's just damning.
So where do we go from here? I mean, I guess if we want to look positively about this, and that's the wrong word, I realise, but the youth custodial population has dropped significantly from the situation 10 years ago. 10 years ago, we had over 3,000 children in various prisons. Now, I think when I last looked at it, it was about 600 or 700. So, and I'm pretty sure that, if I'd been asked 10 years ago, what would you feel about, in 10 years' time, only 600 or 700 children in custody? I'd say, yeah, thank you, I'll take that. But at the same time, the conditions, Joe, as you indicate, remain absolutely appalling. And there are children, and as you say, these are children living in very fearful conditions, which, even if one's adopting the guise of a conventional penal reformer, is hardly likely to be conducive to reform and rehabilitation. So I'm just I feel daunted, actually.
Yeah. Can I just jump in and I don't want to hog the ground here because I don't know if Helen or Hannah want to say anything, right? 2008 was when we had the most number of children in prison, right? So it's been now 13 years that the population's been dropping. And one can predict that for all sorts of reasons. There are ways that we could come to terms with how and why that's happened. But if we're now down, and I've long since maintained that if we ever got down to around the 500 mark, that's the point at which we should be kicking off a campaign for abolishing children's prisons, right? Because you cannot tell, and that's about the world of politics rather than analysis, but you cannot tell me that we have 600 such dangerous children in this world that they must be placed in places like that. I won't believe that. Do you know what I mean? And so at this point, I would encourage anyone who's interested in issues around youth justice to actually start thinking about the campaign group Article 39 and thinking about how we can think differently about doing justice for young people. Because that good news about the whole youth justice sector shrinking like it has means maybe we can actually just get rid of it.
Thank you very much, Joe. And you mentioned Article 39. They are an excellent organisation, and we can share their details in the follow-up email after this event, and also the Alliance for Youth Justice, another really good organisation. So it's unfair to single out just two. There's a number of others, Just for Kid Law. I mean, you could keep going. So there's a number of excellent organisations working in this area, but it's a very difficult and challenging one. Before we move on to the next item, there's a question here from Hazel Roberts. Can it ever be the case that a private company such as G4S, because they are the operators of Oak Hill, private companies such as G4S can prioritise the welfare of children over profit? And it's that kind of, you know, old debate really about public versus private, and whether private prisons are themselves part of the problem here. Joe, a couple of quick thoughts from you on that, maybe, or anyone else, but and then we should move on to the next item.
I can answer that really quickly. It's never going to happen. Do you know? I mean, and maybe I'm, you know, I'm not kind of sitting thinking with my finest, most subtle brain at the moment, but that tension is too great to overcome, and the issue around children's welfare is fundamentally, qualitatively and quantitatively different than the welfare of adults. So I think that those tensions are too profound.
Okay, thank you very much. Debbie Epstein asked a question picking up on the question of coercive control from one of the previous items, and Hannah has written a response to that, so you can see both Debbie's question and Hannah's response in the chat. But let's move on to a related issue, self-harm in prisons. So last week, the latest statistics on death, self-harm and assaults in prisons and immigration removal centres were published. They make for pretty grim reading. The independent analyst Russell Webster has provided a very helpful summary of the statistics on his website, and we'll share a link to Russell's page in the follow-up emails. But, you know, as he points out, and drawing on those statistics, deaths increased by 40% from 283 to 396. 81 of those deaths were suicides, an increase in 13% from the previous 12 months. In the 3 months to June, self-harm incidents had increased by 8% in male institutions and by a whopping 47% in female establishments. And assaults had also increased in the 3 months by 14%. So, you know, one of the questions this really, you know, posed for me is are prisons more lethal for women than they are for men? Is that part of the problem here, or is there something else going on? Hannah, do you have some thoughts about this particular question?
Yeah, I think it's fascinating to get this kind of detail around the different experiences that men and women have within prisons. And obviously, one of the issues is that prisons were generally designed for men, and because of the numbers, it's much easier within the male estate to sort prisoners out by dangerousness or provide different, and I'm clearly not suggesting the male estate is wonderful, but just through sheer economies of scale, it's easier to provide more resources. And then those who actually end up in prison, you know, we know women's offending profile is very different. And I think that there's a couple of issues I wanted to pull out of this in particular. The effects of COVID and the lockdown, I think within the community, I think we started to forget how extraordinary and stressful this last 2 years has been for people, and that lack of contact. And I've found, going back into the office and seeing students face to face, it was quite a shock to the system. It was wonderful, but we've got used to living in a very abnormal way. And for people who've actually been locked in a cell, who've had to cope with lockdown and have had not just the not seeing their friends, but, you know, that kind of distancing from their families, not being able to see them at all, must have been unimaginably difficult. And prisons really were one of the forgotten groups within lockdown in particular. And we know that, you know, a lot of women in prison are the sole carers for their children. Their children were either taken into care or with different relatives. So it has had a disproportionate effect. The lack of mental health care is a problem across the entire prison estate, but I think given the specific needs that women have. And to touch on a controversial point, that actually this shouldn't be a controversial point. This demonstrates the need for sex-based data, and the fact that the Ministry of Justice is collecting data by gender self-identification rather than sex. These kind of figures show us that there is often a difference between how men and women are treated and their experiences and their outcomes, and it's important for everybody that that data is recorded as accurately as possible. I'm not saying don't collect gender ID data, but we really do need, if we lose this kind of data, then it fundamentally disadvantages us in understanding these problems, being able to challenge inequalities, and actually being able to suggest important, practical, workable situations that will save people's lives. So this isn't just an esoteric academic argument about statistics collection, which does not sound the most interesting subject. There are really tangible, important results because of that.
This was something, and we'll be discussing this more in the next item, that Lucy Baldwin at the event last week, the Women's Place event last week, she had a number of really quite heartbreaking examples, you know, and the one that really stuck with me was a mother of young children who absconded from court mid-sentencing to go and collect her children, to take them round to her sister so that their children had somewhere safe, because she could sense she was going to be sent to prison. That's not something that a male prisoner or a male defendant would generally have to worry about. No. And certainly separation from children, and young children in particular, is a deep source of stress and anxiety for many women in prison, in a way that, again, male prisoners, not saying they're obviously not sad, you know, don't find it distressing to be separated from their children, but it's a very different dynamic. Mm. So I think that point about gendered data, which is properly sex-based, is a really important one. Thank you, Hannah, for mentioning that. I just wanted to pick up on a couple of questions coming in on the Q&A. So one from Mark Burton, I mentioned this earlier. He's asking, do persons with lived experience get involved in this particular discussion around self-harm? Really good question, Mark. One of our panelists may want to pick up on that. And also a question here from Kate. Is there any data surrounding correlation of previous experience and instances of self-harm? Well, we have two kind of doctors of criminology here, one a professor of criminology, and I'm sure the other one will soon to be a professor of criminology in the not too distant future. I don't know if either of you have any thoughts on data around correlations around self-harm and previous experience, and also a question of lived experience. Either of you, or indeed Helen, would like to, may not, but any thoughts on any of those questions?
I don't know how detailed it is in full. I mean, things like the Bromley briefings are very useful in terms of, which I think, is it the Prison Reform Trust?
Prison Reform Trust, yeah.
And giving us data on, for example, like how many women in prison have experienced sexual violence or domestic violence. And I think the percentages are sufficiently high. You could say there's probably quite a degree of overlap there. I'm not completely up to date on all the literature, but I think it would certainly be an important thing for people to look at. And again, in terms of being able to put in, identify women who are particularly at risk, and then measures that could be put in place to ensure that they're not left in this kind of distress in custody.
And it was, it was actually something that was just been, women in prison have been talking about this just this morning on Twitter, amongst other places. I'm just looking at their tweet here. Almost 2/3 of women in prison have experienced domestic abuse. This has to change. I'm sure that there are male prisoners who have experienced domestic abuse, but I would be very surprised if they're at anything like that level in terms of, they may well have experienced other violence, of course, and indeed many male prisoners will have experienced violence in their lives, but the skew in relation to domestic abuse victimization is very heavily kind of skewed by birth sex, actually. So that might be is certainly another consideration as well. All right, why don't we move on to our next item, which again is related. It relates to the event that the Centre for Crime and Justice Studies and Women's Place UK held last week in London. One of the, it was certainly the first event that we've held in real life. And I think that's true also. Oh no, I think it was Women's Place second one. So, but the title of the event, Women's Place is Not in Prison. Now, outside a small but vocal and rather intimidating demonstration by trans activists who were hurling racist and misogynistic abuse at arriving delegates, much of it rather too vile to repeat, but some of the less vile, or at least repeatable, What kind of man would you want? What kind of man would want you? A blind man? Hang your head in shame, slave master. Yes, slave master. These were some of the less expletive-ridden abuse that was shouted at arriving delegates. Well, inside, it was a rather more pleasant affair. More than 400 people, mostly women, many of them new to the subject, met to hear a range of speakers, included Frances Crook from the Howard League, or just recently stood down from the Howard League as the long-standing chief executive there. Lucy Baldwin from De Montfort University. I mentioned briefly Lucy's presentation in the previous item. The actress Frances Barber read out a series of very moving testimonies from serving and former female prisoners. Joe Phoenix with us today, we'll come back to that in a second, and the Labour MP Rosie Duffield, who reminded audience of the backgrounds of violence, abuse and poverty of most imprisoned women. So it was really, for me, I think a very significant event, a huge number of people there, possibly the largest event there's ever been on women's imprisonment matters. I can't think of a larger one. And perhaps another sign of the resurgent feminist movement in this country, which is much welcome. Joe, you were one of the speakers, possibly one of the star turns, dare I say, and you gave an absolutely barnstorming speech covering a number of issues, including the whole question about sex-based rights and sex-based protection for female prisoners. It was a week ago. Would you like to maybe share some reflections a week on from that event about about the event and
I've been asking old friends, and when I say old friends, I mean people who are older than me, as opposed to long-lived friends, as to whether or not it really was the largest live collection event, if you like, about women in prison. And so far, the people that I've asked cannot remember any incident where so many people gathered from the general public. It is the case that there have been plenaries at conferences that may have attracted that many speakers, but then of course that's a slightly different thing, isn't it? Because that's, professionals all talking. This was wide open. There's like three things that I want to say about this, and I'm happy if you guys want to. I don't really want to talk about myself, right? So I'm going to give other reflections, and then I may say something just a little bit about myself and my experience of that. To me, one of the most painful speeches to listen to was Lucy Baldwin's. Now, she was telling us that, and I don't mean this in any patronizing way at all. It's actually a mark of respect. She was telling us that which we already know, right? It's not hard to draw the conclusion that actually if there are mothers in prison, there are children who are going to suffer as a result, because we know that mothers do the bulk of the childcare, right? So we know that. So of course it's going to have a deleterious effect on women, and it's going to have a deleterious effect on children and wider families. We can draw that conclusion. But because Lucy's research gave us the quotes, gave us the first-hand experience, and because she is as impassioned a speaker as she was, there were moments in her talk where I was literally struggling not to cry, because it was so gut-wrenching, so gut-wrenching. And of course that raised to me another question, and that's, how do we as academics actually convey some of this material? Because it's very easy to go for those gut-wrenching stories, but also then forget that some of the people who are listening, I don't mean this in the kind of 21st century young people's kind of way of thinking, but some of the people who are listening may have had experiences similar to that. We have to remember that when we talk, we carry with us the burden of the people that we have researched, but also some of the burden and responsibility of the audience. And I thought Lucy got it bang on. I really did. So that to me was an astonishing talk, and I would encourage anyone who's at this webinar today to keep an eye out for when WP UK posts that video. It's important. Frances Barber was extraordinary. She read the words out of serving and former female prisoners. She did it with a light touch and in a way that actually drove a lot of the points home from those those selected excerpts. The other thing that I want to just kind of pause on here for a second is that whole question about, is this the resurgence of feminism in the 21st century? We were talking before we went live about, the fact that there's an awful lot happening about women at the moment. Not to put, any more details on it. We've got a lot about violence against women, policing, the inspection reports, women's places not in prison. And from my point of view, and if I'm going to say anything personal, this is where I'm going to say it. I think what we're really seeing at the moment is a split between the growth of a grassroots feminism, people out in the world who are witnessing these things, struggling with them, trying to figure out how to deal with the effects of sex-based inequality in our lives, and feminism in the academy. Because as many people here will know, feminism in the academy is almost taking two divergent paths. There's some feminism which is like, if I am a feminist scholar, if I am a gender critical scholar, my scholarship is moving much more around, defining women, in terms of sex-based rights, in terms of biology. But there are other feminisms out there that are talking much more about identity and gender identity. And there is, everybody knows, Kathleen Stock today has been on Women's Hour. We know what happened to her at Sussex University. Many of the listeners today, participants, will know what has been happening with me. And yeah, actually, I've just talked myself out. I've talked myself into a dead end.
No, thank you, Jo. You were very modest about not wanting to talk about yourself, which is right a problem. And I do want to just press you on one point, which is, I think you made a very strong case in your speech that it was not transphobic for female prisoners not to want to have male prisoners.
Yeah.
When I say male prisoners, I'm talking about biologically male, people who were born male, who then identify as women. It was reasonable for them not to want to have to share their spaces with those prisoners, whatever those male prisoners might feel about themselves. And this is, as you know, and you know only too well, is a very toxic and challenging issue. I just want to kind of read a tweet here. So this event, when we were publicizing this event over the last 2 weeks, one of our tweets was retweeted. I'm not going to name the person, but what they described in their retweet, they described, the suggestion that it might not be unreasonable for female prisoners not to want to have males in their spaces as a terrible trans-hating position that should be widely condemned. If your anti-punishment politics are anti-trans, then they are absolutely pointless because they actively recreate the degrading, denying, and marginalizing conditions they claim to be challenging. Shameful. What do you think of that, Jo? Yeah, what's your response?
All right, I'm going to throw out a term of art. I think that is conceptual imperialism, right? Taking the struggles of one, transplanting it, and taking over the struggles of another group. We know all sorts of reasons why women, that within female prisons, why people who are born women, natal women, may not want male-bodied individuals around, right? We know, for instance, that there is a much higher percentage of women who are incarcerated who have come from backgrounds of male violence, whether it's sex or abusive, emotional abuse or physical abuse. We also know that there's a really perverse effect of women going to prison, and that's that they often actually have a break from some of the violence that they experience at the hands of their brothers, fathers, partners, and so on. We know this. We know this so much that back in the early 2000s, I think it was South Carolina, possibly North Carolina, were trialing a system whereby women, when they left prison, had to stay in women-only refuges, right afterwards, hostels in effect, whilst they got their life on, back on track. So we know this. It's not hard. It's really not hard. And I think what a lot of people don't realize is that when we're talking about transgender identifying males in a female prison estate, we could be talking about people who have, who have a GRC, who may or may not have had any medical interventions, any surgical interventions, right? And we could be talking about, men who identify as transgender without a GRC and who may or may not have had any surgical interventions. Or any medical interventions. So we can be talking about, and I hate to use this language because, it's a little bit graphic, but we are talking about, men still with penises, with beards, who are still 6'3", and nothing is going to take away from that empirical reality of seeing somebody who's much larger, who is male, in a space that is intimate. Now, we know this as well, and cut me off, Richard, when I need to be cut off here, but we know this as well from the judicial review that recently has published its findings. And the judges in that judicial review said it wasn't transphobic for women to recognize and to say that they didn't want to share their space with men. That it just wasn't, it couldn't be. Because of course, what we're asking of those women in prison is that they give up intimate space. And it's not like, sitting in a cafe when somebody can get up and leave if they don't like the look of, we may not like that people don't like the look of others, but that's part of just being a normal human. It's in the range of human experiences. In a cafe, you can get up and go. But what we are asking, what our government is asking of this particular group of women is that they share intimate space, daily living space, perhaps even showers, perhaps the gym, with people who they may not want to share that with, right? I'll stop there. I believe the video of that talk is going up online sometime tomorrow, I think.
Yes, they're all being released this week, and we'll certainly share the links to where you can find those. There's a question here from, it's a kind of a question stroke statement, but I want to read it from an anonymous attendee. I have been in prison with trans prisoners, one of which was transferred to Low Newton Women's Prison, and it was actually disagreement from male prisoners that stopped this. Do you think the trans issue is watering down the impact on women's issues? Now, I don't want to kind of this whole segment just to be about trans issues, because the event itself was indeed, trans issues were only kind of one aspect of a much richer and wider discussion that evening. Hannah, you attended, so I don't know whether you want to pick up either that point made by anonymous attendee or not. I mean, I think we can just, so it's an interesting question, and thank you for sharing that thought, anonymous attendee. And, but Hannah, you may or may not want to pick up on that, and just maybe other kind of general reflections you might have on what Jo said and on the event itself.
Yes, thank you. I'll come back to that point in a moment, if I may. I found Lucy's presentation astonishing. It's not the kind of research I do, and yes, at one level I knew women in prison with children. I mean, I'm not instinctively a prison abolitionist either, but it was incredibly visceral and painful to listen to, and did exactly what good research should do, which was made me question my own views and assumptions. And that's what we need to do. We can't just sit here with talking shops and all saying, oh yes, this is terrible. I think it was such profound research. It made me really go and think about a lot of issues, and not just very sort of sentimentalist, which I think that there's a danger sometimes just telling one person's story can be. I think the examples were chosen so carefully that they really illustrated something that anybody who is policy making should be thinking about. So in that sense, it was outstanding research. I think this actually draws together quite a number of the themes that we've talked about today, in terms of what are we going to do next. We've talked about these reviews that have been set up by the police and statistics that have been collected, but where are we going with this? And many of the people who are challenging the police and criticizing the police for their actions or inactions or prison policy making, and I'm talking in particular about in politics and in academia, we need to think about our actions as well. It's very easy to throw stones at other institutions. Jo has been too modest to talk about her own work, but the fact that an academic, and also Kathleen Stock's experience, that an academic could be in fear of losing their job for doing what they should be doing. We are in a very, very privileged position as academics in that we can look at what's going on, we can research, we can ask difficult questions. That if a woman in prison who challenges the fact that a male-bodied prison is there with her, that she is subject to sanction for being transphobic, she is in no position to challenge these things. As academics, I think we have a responsibility to be able to ask the hard questions. And as academics, we should be supporting each other in doing that, whether we agree with each other or not. And Jo's fundraiser and the issues she was talking about at the Women's Place meeting, I think raise a very important issue about whether academia is a place that's allowing particularly feminist scholars to ask difficult questions at the moment, but also Rosie Duffield, who came along, and the experience she has had with the, beyond lack of support from the Labour Party, the idea that an MP is too frightened to attend their own party conference is a scandal. And when I hear politicians or commentators saying, we will do everything to challenge violence against women and girls, we come back to the questioner's point. If we cannot identify accurately who are women and girls, then we can't describe the problem in the way that Lucy's research did so powerfully, and we can't actually build any way of tackling these inequalities, not just for women and girls also, but for trans people in prison too. We need accurate data to describe their experiences and support that they need. And some of the loudest voices shouting in this debate and refusing to allow stories to be told or alternative viewpoints to be put forward are doing a grave disservice to women and girls who are suffering, to trans people, to politics, and from a selfish point of view, to academia as well. And I think we need to do something about that. And hopefully Jo's case is another part of challenging that.
Hannah, thank you. I find it difficult, and forgive me, Richard, I know that we need to move on, but I'd like to just say two small things. I do find it difficult to talk about what's happening, partly because of just modesty, but I also find it difficult to talk about it because I can't quite believe it. Do you know what I mean? It's been 3 years now that this stuff is going on, and yet I can't quite believe where we've got to. The other thing that I want to kind of raise and say is that panel that were there, Alison Bailey chaired it. Alison Bailey is having to bring a legal, case because, what happened to her in her own chambers. Rosie Duffield has had problems with the Labour Party. There's been me. Lucy Baldwin, I suspect she hasn't had problems because of the viscerality of what she does. But, even you, Hannah, have been brought into a lot of these problems, and Richard CCJS has. And yet what we're trying to achieve is just some clarity. That's all. There was one statistic that was mentioned, I think it was by Lucy, it might have been by Frances, I can't remember who, that said about the astonishing proportion of the number of women who are in prison who have head injuries, right? Now, I wrote a letter to the Lancet psychiatrist, myself and a number of others, because in point of fact, the 104 people that were included in that sample, or the 112, I can't remember exactly, included something like 6 transgender women. And we're like, this can't happen. You've defined it as women, and yet you're including this proportion of people in. Now, although that letter was accepted to the editor, it was then rejected on the grounds that actually it was too few people to count and it didn't hit the scientific significance. Now, the question I'm just going to raise is, at what point do we say, actually, the adulteration of the sample is such that it compromises the scientific knowledge? In this case, I think it was like 5 or 7%. Is 20% okay? Is 80% okay? We don't know, and we have no yardsticks for this. And if we don't have that accurate data, then we're in a world of pain, you know, and as you've rightly said, for trans people as much as for women, as much as for men. That's all.
Thank you, Joe and Hannah, for those really interesting thoughts. We've had a few more comments in the Q&A. Anonymous attendee, I think, posing the important question about, you know, the whole, not all officers, you know, not all officers are the problem, but as they kind of finish off saying, not all men, not all officers, but how do we know which ones? And, you know, this is a kind of a central question. One of our panel may want to offer a written response to anonymous attendee, and thank you for asking that. There's a question there also from Sam Cowie. I hope, I'm sorry, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce your name, Sam, my apologies, which I think possibly Hannah might be responding to. And also one from Sally Shepherd. Again, maybe one of our panelists might want to respond to that if there's time. Before we just conclude this item, I just want to go back to some of the intimidation that the attendees faced going into an event which frankly was completely unacceptable. Two of the demonstrators were later identified as being members of the Socialist Worker Party, which, whilst they have not exactly condemned the action, they have at least said that they're going to investigate the actions of their members. But I just wanted to leave you on this item, at least, with an observation by Lindsay German, who until relatively recently was a very senior figure within the Socialist Worker Party, left it a few years back. And she wrote a piece on the Counterfire website, which again, we can share the details of that. And in conclusion, this is what Lindsay German said: let's be clear here, gender critical women are not fascists. They are mostly left-wing. They should be allowed to organise as women without being abused and intimidated. And if you think that by doing otherwise is helping fight oppression, you really are in a bad place. This has to stop. The only people it is damaging is the left. Let's move on to our final item. On the Police Crime Sentencing and Court Bill. It's currently making its way through the House of Lords. It's over 300 pages long. It's absolutely mammoth. Covers a range of matters, including potential restrictions on protests, increased police powers, tougher sentences. Much of the work associated with the bill, though, involves detailed line-by-line scrutiny and amendments aimed at removing some elements, for example, that some might consider worrisome, restrictions on protests, for example, or asserting amendments aimed at incremental reform. There's work at the moment to try to insert amendments, for example, around the interment sentences for public protection that we discussed at our previous session. And there's also, just today it's been announced, there's going to be an amendment around what the police can and cannot ask women who've reported rape to share of their mobile phone and other social media content as part of the investigation. Much welcome, I suspect. But another example of these amendments is one relating to short sentences, and my colleague Helen Mills has been working on that. So Helen, would you mind telling us a little bit about where the bill's at? It's in the House of Lords, in the committee stage. Could you just give us a minute or two on what does that actually mean and what happens next? And then the particular amendment that you've been working on in relation to short sentences.
Yeah, sure. So as you say, this bill, having had its first reading in the House of Commons, is now in the House of Lords, and as Richard just said, at the committee stage. This is the stage at which amendments that have been tabled are brought before the committee and either removed or will be voted on by the committee. And if voted on and those amendments stay, then when the bill goes back to the House of Lords, they would then be voted on in the House of Lords, and then if they pass the vote there, they would then become part of the bill, then become part of the act. So that's the very kind of long journey we'd be talking about there. So at this committee stage, and as you said, huge bill and huge number of amendments, and we've been trying to track a few of those. What is likely to be happening, I think, in practical terms, and for those who are kind of listening and engaging with this from the kind of reform world will know, is that there is an awful lot of amendments being tabled and put forward. In fact, they've been whittled down really to very few that will be actually voted on. And that's quite a hard-headed, I guess, process, at least part of which is about which of these amendments is likely to actually get through the Commons, on which of these amendments it's worth having a debate about and raising these issues and finding out where the debate's at, but actually is very unlikely to become part of the bill. So that's all part of the kind of process at the minute. So we have many more amendments than are ever likely to be voted on or become part of the bill. There's a few I kind of think are worth drawing. I mean, there's loads in there. I'm going to miss loads, but the few that I'm going to mention that you've kind of drawing attention to, there's the one you've mentioned that we've been working on around the custody threshold. So this is the centre's spent maybe the last few years really thinking about the issue of short prison sentences. And it's been a long target for those in kind of prison reform to try to reduce the number who are on a short-term prison sentence for a lot of arguments, a lot of reasons. The piece of legislation that we have put forward with the help of Professor Andrew Ashworth is about strengthening the custody threshold, which means tightening the criteria by which a sentencer is deciding whether or not custody is the appropriate sentence for someone, and that includes, and it's you know, without going into the wording of the amendment itself, what we were particularly keen to focus on is the issue, these kind of concrete issues in sentencing and why they currently result in a short prison sentence, and whether there's anything that can concretely be done and built on about that. And a priority amongst that is persistence. So how can we better respond to those who are what will be termed as low level or not, you know, non-serious, non-violent, non-sexual offenders who come before the courts, but do so on multiple occasions. This is a huge frustration among kind of sentencers that we've engaged with during our project work. And so our piece of legislation is particularly aimed at that and about how persistence can be dealt with by sentencers in the community. Still be used as a factor in sentencing, of course, but would not be a factor that will push someone over the custody threshold. Other matters in there that we have are building on work that women in prison have been doing, and also the Joint Committee on Human Rights on the rights of dependent children, as we've been talking about actually earlier on in our seminar today. The rights of dependent children outweighing the benefits of punishing women by sending them to prison is also part of the legislation that we put forward. Although interestingly, this amendment that we've been advising on is probably going to be discussed in committee early next week, although with delays that might be pushed back a bit. The bill is quite delayed from where it was anticipated at this point. But this week, what has been discussed on Monday was that issue. There was another amendment that was put forward around dependent children and consideration around primary carers, and that was removed prior to the vote in consideration of the arguments that came up against any reform on this issue was that there is current sentencing guidance around this. That should be enough, not seen as a need for legislation. And that that sentences, according to some, are already taking into account the needs of children in sentencing. This is about individual sentences rather than about the system. So those are some of the things we heard on Monday this week in the committee. And as you pointed out, Richard, another area that we're currently working on at the centre is IPP, and there's a couple of amendments that have been proposed around that. One of which is to have, as we were talking about earlier, to have a review on the arrangement for IPP IPP prisoners that would report in 6 months and would look at various aspects of what IPP sentencing and about the adequacy of arrangements. There is another amendment about reducing the tariff for people who are still being held on IPP sentences. Once you are over tariff, that you can only be over tariff to reduce that to being 10 years over your initial sentencing tariff to be considered for release. The interesting thing around those IPP amendments and they may, I was reflecting back on what Donna may have said in last month's seminar around IPP. I guess some of them may feel like slow progress, though it is significant that the Lord who is tabling some of those is Lord Blunkett, who of course was the architect originally of the IPP sentence.
Thank you, Helen. We're going to have to draw things to a very swift conclusion because we're almost out of time. We had a bit of kind of some sound issues in that final segment again. My apologies to our audience. Sounds like you had a bit of a woodpecker or something there, Helen, but I'm sure we'll sort it out for the future, but my apologies that there was some distortion on the sound. Maybe what we'll do is see if we can persuade Helen to write up a short note of that as a comment piece, which we can post on our website, because I think that was a really helpful run across some of the key amendments that are coming through, which are definitely worth watching. So it's going through the House of Lords, and then it'll be back to the House of Commons either, I think, late this year or early 2022, and definitely a bill that's worth anybody who's interested in the way that legislation interacts with what then becomes law. It's a crucial bill, and it's certainly well worth watching. Right, well, look, we're out of time, so I think it just leaves me to thank Hannah, Jo, and Helen for fantastic, really interesting discussion. So thank you, all three of you, and thank you also our audience for coming along, and thank you especially to those who gave us a donation when you registered. These things do cost money to run. We don't charge because we're a public education charity, and it's important that everybody can participate in these events, whether they can afford to pay or not. But thank you those who gave us a donation when you registered. It's very much appreciated.